In any court battle or debate, a good tactic to build credibility for your argument is to acknowledge the points of your opponent, either by showing that the point is valid but irrelevant or trivial, or perhaps by proving that the conclusion is incorrect. When I tackle any subject, I try to make sure to examine both sides of the argument, as part of the reason I started doing these videos was because I was tired of people doing nothing but unchecked rampages over perceived disappointments, or pure ecstasy-filled adorations of nostalgic classics, without striving to balance them out with a viewing of the opponent's arguments. That's not to say that I don't have films with which I do neither with, and that I don't sometimes contribute to the problem, but there are very few films that I'd label either a masterpiece or complete garbage, because I find these exaggerations are thrown out far too often, with a lot of my colleagues painting middle-of-the-road films as complete train wrecks. The James Bond series is no stranger to this trend, and one of those that I often find at the bottom is Never Say Never Again. Much maligned by fans of the official films, it's become the butt of jokes and ranks often towards the bottom of lists. But like all Bond films, it has its staunch defenders, who praise the return of Connery, the return of a film that's more thoughtful about its pacing and set pieces, and one that tries to make a case for a different kind of Bond film than what Eon was doing at the time. It's compelling to see a different crew offer a sort of rebuttal to the campy, bombastic adventures that were the norm at this time, and if nothing else, I'm glad the film exists to provide this kind of counterpoint. I covered part of this film's production history back when I did the review for Thunderball, so let's pick it up from there. After the release of that film, Kevin McClory, the man who held the screen rights to the novel, had a 10-year moratorium where he was not allowed to make another Bond film. In the meantime, Eon and United Artists kept using Spectre and Blofeld in their series until 1971. They took a break from that storyline to try some new things, but when they came around to wanting to use them again, the moratorium was up, and McClory put forth a lawsuit, which ruled that McClory owned the rights to Spectre and Blofeld. Thus, Eon had to change their plans for 1977's The Spy Who Loved Me. McClory brought together Sean Connery and screenwriter Len Deighton to work on a new version of the story titled Warhead. Kevin felt Sean was necessary to this process as he understood the character of Bond better than anyone else at the time. Though it's important to note that at this stage of the project, Sean was only helping with the script. He didn't start to consider returning as Bond until sometime later. The reason Warhead never got made was because Eon claimed that Kevin was veering away from what he could legally do, which was make a version of Thunderball. And from what I could find, the project was indeed in danger of doing this. The Warhead script involved Spectre shooting down airplanes over the Bermuda Triangle and staging an invasion of New York City. So the picture was delayed for quite some time. It started to come together again when two people got involved, Jack Schwartzman and Lorenzo Semple Jr. Schwartzman, then husband to actress Talia Shire, was an entertainment lawyer who helped to clear a number of legal issues for the project. He then became the credited producer sometime later. Lorenzo Semple Jr. was a well-respected screenwriter, being known for 3 Days of the Condor and the Adam West Batman show. Semple had already had a history with Bond, having worked with Gregory Ratoff on a version of Casino Royale well before Dr. No was made. Semple made some great progress on the script, but once Irvin Kershner was hired as director, things went south. Kershner wasn't liking a lot of the material, and at one point people got worried that Sean was going to drop out of the film. Semple was fired in order to appease them. Connery then brought in British TV writers Dick Clement and Ian LaFreniere, and the film finally gained enough traction to reach the production stage. Sean Connery was formally announced to play Bond again in 1982, and thus the film became a serious contender against Eon and their upcoming film, Octopussy. The main story follows a lot of the same beats from the novel and the original film. After 2 weeks of training exercises, the new M is not impressed with James Bond's performance and orders him to go to a health clinic. While there, Bond comes across the specialized nurse and a patient that seem to be up to no good. Upon searching the patient's room, Bond finds the logo of a man named Maximilian Largo. At the same time, 2 atomic warheads are stolen from a nearby airbase, and Spectre is claiming responsibility. Upon traveling to the Bahamas, Bond links his 2 suspects and Largo to the scheme, as well as discovering that Largo's mistress is Domino Patachi, whose brother was the patient at the clinic. Bond must race against time and use all of his assets in order to stop SPECTRE from using the bombs for its nefarious purposes. Never Say Never Again is really interesting, both from a historical viewpoint and as a completed film. After 21 years of an established style for James Bond that had been hugely successful, is it possible for another group to come in and show that the folks at Eon are not the only ones who can make a Bond film? Much of the success of the so-called golden age of Bond in the 60s was attributed to the near-perfect marriage of Sean Connery and 007. So perhaps that, along with a solid cast, crew, and screenplay, should be enough to remind people of why they fell in love with this character. Except the origins of this film are not so pure. They stem from two people wanting to correct perceived mistakes of the past, and that creates an air of negativity about the project. Connery probably never would have done this film if he had left the previous ones amicably, much as Roger Moore would do 2 years later. And you get the sense that McClory always had a bone to pick with Eon, since he was involved with Fleming before Dr. No and arguably helped to create the cinematic Bond. Couple that attitude with the lack of many of the traditional elements of a Bond film, and you can see why so many people have a hard time getting into this one. When I initially got the film on DVD back in the mid-2000s, it took me 5 sittings to get through it, and I often went back to the menus to watch the theatrical trailer in order to get an injection of excitement. With time and hindsight, I could see my younger self wasn't ready to accept a new take on Bond, since I was much more comfortable with Brosnan's high-flying antics and adrenaline-fueled rides. Today, I find more to enjoy about it, and dare I say, I actually spent the first half of one of my recent viewings enjoying the differences between this and the Moore films that I have been covering up until now. Unfortunately, it came crashing down in the second half, and upon reflection, I found that I was enjoying the potential of the first half more than anything else, and when none of it paid off, it reminded me of why this has never been a favorite of mine. No one is more disappointed than I am. I really tried to view this with a fresh perspective, and I succeeded until the story leaves the Bahamas behind. My reevaluation comes to this. Never Say Never Again is incredibly dull. The story has quite a number of gaping holes and contrivances. The action is rather unremarkable. The character development is feeble. Most of the performances either do nothing or hinder the film, and I can't even enjoy the return of Sean because he's playing a different character than before. Sean was one of the greatest actors ever to grace James Bond as a franchise, and those first 6 outings with him contained a lot of magic just with his presence. He had a cat-like cool about him. The immense confidence radiated off of him. He had a rebel-like charm whenever he spoke, and you either fell in love with him or became nervous about being his enemy. Here, there is none of that, and thus I feel like the film misses out on the point of getting Connery back as Bond. We've now had 6 different actors portray the cinematic Bond in the official series, and each has been quite different with their takes, and that's what we love about them. If you get Connery back, you want him to play the version of Bond that he was doing before, or someone that feels like an older version of that same man. Yet when I watch this film, it's clear that Connery is playing the character quite different to how he did before. I probably shouldn't have expected any less, given that this is made by a different creative team and Connery is 12 years older than the last time he wore the shoulder holster. But what I'm getting at is that by Connery deliberately doing something different, it feels dishonest to sell this film based on his past with the character because it's not what you're getting. This isn't a 30-year-old Connery in the prime of his character. This is a 50-year-old Connery nearing the end of what feels like a different man's career. Take Hugh Jackman as Wolverine. He's been playing the same character for over 20 years, and we are about to see him take on the role again. Even though the films take place in different timelines and different universes, he still feels like the same basic character, obviously shifted around to work with the needs of the stories. And so we can have films like Deadpool 3 market Jackman's return to the character and it feels justified. If Connery isn't going to play a version of Bond that is identifiable with his earlier efforts, then the novelty is lost on me. You might as well put Richard Burton or James Mason in this part. I wouldn't mind this as much if the new take on Bond was as captivating on its own merits, but it's not. Connery seems to have either forgotten or is deliberately playing against some of the fundamental things that Bond is known for. He's got the humor and the charm down, but I don't think he's suave, dangerous, putting the mission ahead of his desires or anything like that. So he feels no more like James Bond than any other action hero from the 80s. At the end of the day, it goes to show that there was more to Bond's success as a franchise than any one actor. You can't just put Connery in a tux and expect to have your bases covered with me. There's more to it than that. And while Connery is doing what he can where he can, I feel like this is a misguided direction to go with the character, thereby making this film feel like an uninspired take on the greatest cinematic hero. The final strike for me is this movie's attitude towards the Eon films. The filmmakers are so determined to do things differently to the official series that the movie seems shackled. Never Say Never Again can't flourish in its goals because it's too timid to go all the way with its ideas, either into new territory or to show up Eon in doing the traditional Bond elements. When it's doing new things, it's stifled. Character arcs are either rushed, missing connecting tissue, or non-existent. The plot assumes that you are already familiar with the other version's presentation of the story, and so it glosses over things like how Bond connects Largo to the theft of the bombs, or why Domino suddenly cares enough about Bond enough to pose a threat to her relationship with Largo. And when it's doing familiar things, it's mishandling so much of it. Blofeld and Spectre are robbed of all the color that makes them interesting as concepts. With the exception of the fight scene at Shrublands, the action falls flat and never has the electricity that the Eon films often have. The dialogue scenes aren't interesting enough in their subtext to keep me engaged, so neither plan of attack on this material seems to be working, resulting in a film that I'm mostly bored or confused by. And that's as damning a statement as I can say about a Bond film. Even with other films that are towards the bottom of my list, Spectre, A View to a Kill, Casino Royale 1967, there are enough elements that each of them has to make them worth revisiting for a full rewatch. Never Say Never Again is a vanilla imitation of a Bond film, and so I almost never revisit it unless I am rewatching all of the series. Regardless of whether he's playing a version of Bond that I like or not, Sean Connery really is the star of the show. His performance here only magnifies my problems with his offering in You Only Live Twice. The investment of the star in the picture does a lot to carry me through it. He seems to be happy to do a Bond on his terms, and there's such a sparkle about him here. He's putting in some serious work to make me care about this version of Bond. As the film goes on, it starts to play so much like a traditional action film that much of the magic is lost. But in the beginning, the film rejoices at having him back, and so it's more aware of how lucky it is to be starring Connery again than Diamonds Are Forever was. To summarize, Connery's not playing a version of Bond that I like, but he's injecting life where he can, and thus elevates the film a bit. Most of the rest of the cast either doesn't move the dial for me or drags the film down, with 3 exceptions. I've never gotten along well with Kim Basinger's version of Domino. A woman who seems to love too hard and too fast in the wrong places, she's swept up by Bond into his world, and she does her best to stay aloft in the deep end of the pool of espionage. I'm baffled as to why she falls so quickly for Bond. Based on the few interactions I see them have before they kiss in the dance studio, I don't feel like they have enough chemistry, nor has Bond earned that trust yet. Sure, he tells her about Jack's death, but how does she know that he has her best interests at heart? The first time they met was under false pretenses, and we don't get to hear much of the subsequent conversation over drinks, so the necessary building blocks of the relationship are missing. I'm not saying I needed a whole section of the film to be devoted to their relationship, though given that Bond settles down with her at the end and retires, that may have helped, but a little can go a long way. Take a look at Bond and Domino in the original film. They only have 4 real scenes of development before Bond tells her about her brother, but it gets a whole lot of work done. We see a real spark between the two. We see how Largo's mistreatment of her and her general search for excitement leads her into Bond's arms, and we get to see him treat her properly. Here, we get some banter, though it doesn't quite have the energy I feel like they need to justify that ending, and then we get more banter that we are shown but not allowed to hear. So much of what makes Domino interesting is gone from the film, and so she is one of the lesser Bond women. This is not a performance criticism, it's a criticism of the script. I mentioned before in my women ranking video that Basinger just seems to be playing the emotions in the moment, and that doesn't coalesce into a concrete character. This is what I'm talking about. Domino is a character whose story arc is butchered by missing pieces, and doesn't have enough individual color to her personality, so I can't bring myself to care about her. Maximilian Largo is my least favorite Bond villain. Civility masking craziness is a fun idea, but we never get to see a moment where he really goes over the edge and delivers on that promise. His crazy moments and attitude feel tame to me, and so he comes off as a low-key villain without much charm, the standard corrupt, eccentric businessman who loves power. During my most recent viewing, he reminded me of another villain in this series, Dominic Green. A weirder-looking guy who's supposedly charming, a key part of an organization, and almost weirdly the same organization, a philanthropist, a girlfriend who becomes aligned with Bond, and has a streak of jealousy. As much as I don't care for Green, he does have his moments of explicit villainy, and I believe he's capable of conducting a scheme at the behest of his masters, while also being noteworthy on his own merits. This version of Largo just feels like a TV villain of the week, and so he passes by without imprinting himself much on my mind. I love the choice of Max von Sydow as Blofeld. If he's only going to be in the movie for a few minutes, this is the kind of actor you get to make sure you do justice to the character. But Kirshner's desire to move away from the more over-the-top comic book elements of the character leads him to be more of a corrupt businessman than the head of a major crime syndicate, and so the talent is wasted. There apparently were a number of deleted scenes with him, and I really wish I got to see them so I can determine if the character suffers from a chopped-up film, or if it really is a creative blunder that I can pin on Kirshner. Edward Fox as M is a great casting choice. Being a few years younger than Bond and thus of a different generation, I don't mind the idea of the two being in conflict over the direction of the service. But Fox plays him as a fed-up caricature. He seems too exaggerated in those frustrations, almost comically so. And his only moment of redemption is via a radio call towards the end, which feels like a cheap way to show progression with the man. The less I say about this version of Moneypenny, the better. Rowan Atkinson feels so out of place with this film, but given the lack of interest I have in the story, I can at least enjoy his character on a dumb fun kind of level. Alright, enough knocking this cast. Let's move on to the people that really do work for me. First up is Barbara Carrera. She's a flame of joy in this film. Carrera was apparently offered both this and Octopussy, and I have a feeling she would have been Magda there, but I'm so glad things played out the way that they did. A villainess who uses her sexuality as part of her toolset and takes great delight in her work is my kind of fun. She embodies the craziness far more than Largo does, and so I'm sad to see her go. She's not quite in my camp of favorite henchmen, but I rejoice in her spark of genuine and unique creativity to this film. She also enlivens other characters by her presence, key point being Largo. They seem to be cackling with delight in their dialogue, and while that goes against what Largo is supposed to be, I'd rather have this kind of cartoony camp to my villainy than this film's rather dull take on so-called realistic villains. Bernie Casey brings an element of good-natured fun to the role of Felix Leiter. After Jack Lord and Dr. No, the Eon films struggled to find a suitable replacement for Connery to play off of. Casey and Connery feel like really old friends from the first minute of film they share together, and I light up when he pops back into the story. While most of the MI6 crew is either boring or dreadful to me, Alec McCowan's Algernon, better known as Q, is a delight. Instead of the perpetually annoyed Boothroyd of Desmond Llewellyn, Algernon feels like a crackpot inventor that genuinely likes the chaos that Bond brings to the business, and their dynamic feels fresh. I would love for a future Bond and Q to have something like this and be allowed several films together so that we can explore it more. Finally, Valerie Leon's return to the series is pretty fun. Is it weird that I think she shares more chemistry with Connery than Basinger? The set pieces of the film puzzle me. The opening training exercise seems like a fine way to begin the film, but there's an obvious problem with this that I'll cover in a minute. The fight at Shrublands with Indiana Jones legend Pat Roach is loads of fun. There are a few gags at work here, and it's one of the places where Bond's age is worked into the film appropriately. Being well past his physical prime, Bond must use the tools in his environment to take the guy down. And the gag with his pee being almost toxic to Lippy and leading to his death is hilarious. The shark attack could be a lot better, but it's competent enough, well photographed, and makes for a better shark scene than anything in Jaws 3 or 4. The motorbike chase is too restrained, and I wish it had more than just a rocket boost, but I love the idea of a Q-rigged motorbike, and I wish a future film would expand on this. The finale in the temple looks fine, but it's missing a lot of the beats that previous films had for their climaxes. It feels small and rushed. Many of the past Bond films have featured big shootouts in elaborate locations, and every one of those that I can think of is a better finale than this one. Largo's final moments are poorly handled. I feel no tension between him and Bond in the fight. The emotional payoff with Domino is nowhere to be seen, and we don't get to see what this means to the two of them, so the moment is squandered. By far, the worst production aspect of this film is the music. Michael Legrand is a very talented musician and composer, having won 3 Oscars from 13 nominations. But the jazz and bossa nova couched with some orchestra totally kills any excitement or tension in the action scenes, and the rest of the time it sounds like elevator music. Apparently both James Horner and John Barry were considered, and I bet you all the money in my wallet that either of them would have come up with a fine score. The title song is also my least favorite in the series. Not only does it not stand out against any of the other love ballads that the official series has had to offer, I think it's a really boring tune. And the feelings of negativity are only multiplied by the insane choice to place the song over the opening training exercise. It sucks out any good feeling I might have had towards the sequence, and given that it is the reintroduction of the mythical Connery to the role of 007, that's an incredible error to make. I have many of the Bond scores on various formats, and I rotate through them quite frequently. But even if this album was more widely available, I don't think you could convince me to buy it unless I was bitten with a completionist desire. It would be very easy to spend the rest of this review just stating how Thunderball is a better movie than this, but I'd like to go in a different direction. I'd like to point out a couple of things that I think this film does better than the 1965 adventure, as well as list some interesting observations I made in comparison to other Bond projects. Thunderball was heavily criticized for its over-reliance on underwater scenes. Never Say Never Again tones down the amount of the scenes, as well as condensing the theft of the bombs. It cuts to the chase a lot quicker, and we don't have to see every step in detail. We are shown just enough to get the point, and then we move on. When Blofeld records his video, much of that scene plays in voiceover, and I actually kind of prefer Cito's voice representing the character to physically seeing him with a white cat. Both films of 1983 feature trick pens, which is doubly interesting because both films from 1967 also shared a gadget. The laser watch and exploding pen were ideas that came back in a new form in GoldenEye. The Q-bike is not an idea that the Eon films have ever toyed with. Apparently Cubby thought motorbikes provided too pedestrian of an action sequence. But the Everything or Nothing video game finally gave Bond a gadget-laden bike, and it was a main selling point of that adventure. Next up, let's do a round of disparate observations and comments. I love that Fatima just beats on Jack Patachi for smoking, and we mostly hear a ruckus of noise off screen. Something about that is really funny to me. When the blind goes up and exposes Bond, I'm confused as to why that happens. Did Bond intentionally reveal himself, or was that an accident? If it was intentional, what does it accomplish? And doesn't it kind of backfire since that's how Fatima becomes aware of Bond's presence and sends Lippy after him? When Blofeld says that if the demands are not met within 7 days, they will enact revenge, what is he talking about? Is Spectre getting revenge for a specific thing, or is it just a cool line to precede the explosion footage? What does the film gain by having Bond in the Bahamas? All he learns there is that Largo's boat is headed over to France, so why couldn't the mission have just started there? The only reason I can think of is that the filmmakers had to set part of the film in the Bahamas in order to appease outside parties and show them that this really was a remake of the Thunderball novel, and it's so sad that an entire location is wasted just for production reasons. The video games at the casino are an incredibly dated idea, and I dislike the game of domination that they play. Honestly, that whole section felt like it could have come from one of John Gardner's continuation novels. When Bond arrives at the Tears of Allah, he needs Domino's pendant to tell him where Largo is placing the bomb. I feel like Bond could have put 2 and 2 together since he knows where the oil fields begin, and both M and Largo have hinted that oil was part of the scheme in earlier scenes. Was there anything else in this area that might have been an interest to Largo and Spectre? I dislike most everything about this final scene. The film starts out with an intriguing idea. Bond has more to offer, even in his older age. Bond proves this by going on a delicate mission and foiling Spectre's plans. But once he accomplishes his mission, he just retires? Isn't that a big middle finger to the people that you were looking to win over to your side? Plus, just because the plan was stopped doesn't mean Spectre isn't still a threat and won't come back in the future. I know there wouldn't have been more films to follow this up, unless McClory just kept remaking Thunderball, but I feel like a more appropriate ending to this idea is what Skyfall does later. Bond returns to MI6, and the film ends by giving the audience a wink and a smile that he's ready to get back to work and hasn't lost a step. I've also talked about how I don't buy that his relationship with Domino is enough to make him pack it all in. And by the way, this is the weakest of Connery's on-screen relationships, with the exception of Kissy Suzuki. An interesting tidbit, I didn't actually see all of this movie until last year. I own the first DVD version of the film, which was done by Warner Home Video, which omits Bond's second encounter with Domino and his formal introduction to Largo at the casino. When I originally saw the film, I thought my DVD had just skipped to the next chapter. It ends with Bond leaving the guy in the closet with his cigar case pretending it's a bomb. A hilarious gag, by the way. And then it cuts to Largo and Bond going to play Domination. I felt like there was a decent chunk missing, but since I never watched the film on anything other than that DVD, I never saw those scenes until I happened to catch the film on streaming services. As much as I would love to say otherwise, Time and Tide has not been kind to Never Say Never Again for me, and it easily stands as my least favorite Bond film. I know it has its fans, I can sort of see where they're coming from, and honestly, I should be among them. On paper, this is more what I want from a Bond picture in style and tone. However, the mess of a production led to a jumbled puzzle of a film that's missing some key pieces and substitutes them with ones from other puzzles. You get the idea of what they were going for, but much of the construction is so poorly done that it works against itself. The longer the film goes, the more convinced I become that simply having Connery in the lead role and doing a more low-key adventure that strays away from some of the traditional elements of the cinematic Bond was a thankless enterprise that easily got derailed. There is merit to the picture, and this is nowhere near the worst spy film I've ever seen. But by clearing out much of the tweaks that Eon has since added to the character and the formula, the result is an empty field, with not much unique to engage the audience beyond the novelty. If anything, this film makes me even more appreciative of the earlier Connery films and how they captured lightning in a bottle. Connery was a key ingredient to the success of the 60s films, but he's not the only reason the spy craze took off. And Never Say Never Again proved that Eon's films, however crazy they get in ambition and however wide in the quality spectrum they can be, are too tall of an achievement in the cinematic landscape to easily overcome without some real work and effort. I know a lot of this can be blamed on the nightmarish production. The filmmakers were hampered by legal requirements, inexperienced producers, trouble in the writing room, uncooperative actors, and so on. But whatever the reasons are that the film doesn't work for me, the problem is that the film doesn't work for me. There are plenty of films that have had equally troubled productions with inexperienced people at the helm that managed to churn out a fine product, and that's kind of the point. These things happen, and there's no reason that these talented filmmakers couldn't have worked within those limitations and delivered a shining gem. So unfortunately, Never Say Never Again has become a bit of a footnote in the legacy of the character, despite its intriguing features, and Octopussy won the Battle of the Bonds in 1983. Kevin McClory's story doesn't stop here, and we'll tackle some of the specifics in a future video, but suffice it to say for now, the rights to Never Say Never Again were purchased by MGM in the late 90s, and thus this rogue outlier came back under the same roof as the Eon Bond films. After tackling the biggest challenge the series had seen up to this point, and with Roger Moore fast approaching his late 50s, Cubby Broccoli, John Glenn, and the rest of the crew decided to charge ahead undaunted and continue with making more official Bond films. And 1985's A View to a Kill would mark both the end of one saga while also heralding the dawn of a new era.